Hello everyone, welcome to today's session on how to get published. My name is Amey. I am the portfolio manager for the Association's journal here at Taylor and Francis, and I will be chairing the session today. So just to do a few points of housekeeping first, I'm going to stop sharing my screen just for a moment to go through these. So I will be presenting the first segment of today's session for about 20 or 30 minutes, giving some tips and information on how to get published in a journal from a publisher's perspective. Excuse me. I'll then be passing over to Chris Pascal, president of ESERA, and Tony Bertram, who is editor of the journal, European Early Childhood Education Research Journal, which I will abbreviate to ESERJ from now onwards. And they are a very strong team that work together to steer the journal and have done since the beginning, since it was launched. They will give some perspectives on how to get published from the editor point of view. So just to flag that this session will be recorded and will be available for 60 days after today. So some of you will be watching live, whereas others will be watching the recording, but I hope that you enjoy this today, however you engage. If you're joining us live, please note that your cameras and microphones cannot be switched on. So this is working as intended, but you can engage in one of two ways. You can use the chat function, which will be at the bottom of your screen. You can use that to say hello, share your thoughts or comments or reactions to anything the speaker says, or to chat with each other. If you use the chat, please post the comments to everyone so everyone can see what you have said. And you can also use the Q&A section that's on the bottom of your Zoom screen as well. So that's a separate box to the chat area. And we will only take questions from the Q&A section. I won't be looking at the chat. We will hear from all three speakers first, and then we'll move on to the Q&A for everyone at the end of the session. If you're watching this later as a recording, you can also leave comments in the comments section beneath the video. With this in mind, I'd like to remind everyone that all posts made are public and that all comments should be made professionally and respectfully. So any comments in the chat function will show with the username you've logged in with today and will, of course, appear in the recording of the session. Okay, so without further ado, I will share my screen again and go back to the presentation. So just 1 second whilst I do this. Okay, so today's slides by me will be focusing on publishing in academic journals. And I will talk you through the following points: who Taylor and Francis are as the publisher of ESERJ, choosing the right journal to publish in and how to write for that journal, what to expect from peer review, and some final steps ahead of publication if you are accepted. This will be a whistle-stop tour of how to get published, so it might not cover absolutely everything, but Chris and Tony can pick up some more detailed points and we'll have time for questions at the end. So Taylor and Francis, we are the oldest commercial journals publisher in the world. We've been publishing journals since 1798. And in this case behind me, you'll see bound copies of one of the earliest journals. We work in partnership with learned societies and universities, such as ESERA. On the societies end, we publish across science, social science, humanities, technology, arts, and medicine. But we are the biggest humanities and social sciences publisher in the world. So a lot of our journals are within those areas. Taylor and Francis has more than 2,700 journals across all disciplines. I'll now talk through how to choose the right journal for your work. It might be that most of you will wish to publish in eSurge as eSeria's journal, but of course you'll contribute to many journals across your career. So here are some best tips on how to select one. We recommend that you begin by selecting a journal. So it's good to be in the minority here. 30% of authors write for a specific journal, whereas 70% write the article and then panic. This will really help to focus and write your article if you choose the journal straight up front. A good starting point is to research the journals available in your field. Do you want to go for a generalist journal or a more niche title that is focused on a more specialized area? Do you want it to have international reach or be more specific to a local region? That will help narrow down the available journals to you. You can visit your university library or any library website that's available in these COVID times. You can talk to your peers and see where other people have published. We'd also recommend looking at publisher and journal websites. So there's a huge amount of information online that publishers provide to try and help potential authors to select a journal. Finally, once you have a short list of some possible journals, it's important to understand the journal's aims and scope. So this is a statement that summarizes the goals of the journal and what sort of content it publishes. And this is really important to take note of. You'd be surprised how many authors submit to a journal, but they do something that's actually outside of the journal's aims and scope. Looking at the people behind the journal is a good strategy as well. So find out who the editor or editors are, if they are working in the same field and same area as you, what their affiliations are. Similarly, look at the same things for the editorial boards. Who is the publisher of the journal? This can be interesting sometimes and might influence certain policies of what is possible to publish in that venue. Who are the authors? So you can look at some previously published research and work out where those authors are and what fields they work within, which departments they're in, to try and see if it fits to your intended piece. Is there a society affiliation as well? So of course, eSeria is the society behind eSurge. Many journals have similar affiliations or arrangements. Many journals are just affiliated with a publisher without an external society. There are some key policies listed here that are really good pointers to find out when you're thinking about a journal. So it's helpful to establish if it publishes online or in print, or whether it does both, as most journals do cover both. What type of peer review does it follow, if it does follow peer review? And is this transparently outlined in a peer review statement on the journal website? So for example, does it use 2 reviewers for every piece or follow a different process? What is the process of actually submitting your work to the journal? So does it use a submission system, or do you email the editors directly with your manuscript? Because that can affect whether you would want to submit there. With a submission system, you can usually have a little bit more information on tracking where your manuscript is during peer review compared to emailing it to someone directly. Whether the journal has an open access policy is quite important to find out, especially as your institution or funder might have mandates on this. For example, authors with UKRI funding need to publish their work open access from now on. So that means that it wouldn't be subscription content that's behind a paywall. It would be available to anyone with an internet connection. So you would want to work out how the journal approaches open access, whether it's a fully OA journal or whether it's purely subscription with no open access option. Another type of journal is called hybrid, and that is the eSurge policy. So it has mostly subscription content, but there is an open access option in the journal too for some individual manuscripts. It's also a good idea to check out the article types published in a journal. So the vast majority of academic journals are based around original research articles, and that's kind of like the standard piece. Policies do vary a lot more on other article types. So review articles, literature reviews and book reviews may or may not be accepted in various journals. And in addition to this, types such as essays or discussion pieces or comment pieces that are more opinion-based may or may not be acceptable depending on the venue. So that can really influence your choice of journal too. I want to flag the Think, Check, Submit initiative here. And this is a publisher neutral website and sort of project that provides authors with a toolkit to assess whether a journal is legitimate. Sorry. It provides a checklist of various points that you can go through and basically see if a journal meets these points and can be sort of assessed as a genuine journal versus a predatory journal. So a predatory journal would be one that takes a fee for publication from authors, but does not actually do the normal work of an academic journal. So they wouldn't complete peer review or do any copy editing. They would just take the manuscript you send to them and post it online, you know, in exchange for a fee from you. So yes, this initiative is to try and reduce this scam. You probably would also look at journal citation metrics in choosing your publication venue. So these are widely interpreted as a way of measuring quality by librarians, researchers, tenure and promotion committees, publishers, and grant awarding bodies. But what actually are they? So citation metrics essentially calculate the average number of citations over a specific time period. And they calculate that for a journal as a whole, not for individual articles in that journal. The most common citation metric is the impact factor. And this is owned by the Web of Science. There is also the site score that's been developed more recently that's run by Scopus. And both these metrics provide a different way of assessing how much a journal is cited over time by other journals and other articles. They are often used to indicate the quality of a journal, but they're just one element to consider when assessing quality and assessing the best place to publish. There are also quite a lot of limitations from them. So as with any average figure, they can be skewed quite easily by very highly cited articles that would then make the figure much more inflated compared to the normal sort of citation rate for that journal. They're also very limited in terms of the time periods that they cover. So they cover a period of 3 years generally for the impact factor. And therefore, they don't really work that well with fields where it takes longer for work to be cited, because they wouldn't be captured in this actual statistic based on the way it's calculated. So essentially, they are a useful measure, but they are imperfect. And if you would like more information about research metrics, including citation metrics, there is a helpful link here to a Taylor and Francis resource that explains everything, because there is a lot out there in terms of research metrics. It's a lot of quantitative information to keep up with. And yeah, it's good to have something that breaks it down and explains. So once you've chosen a specific journal, we'd recommend that now is the time to start writing. A helpful exercise is to try and think like an editor. So we have a quote here from the former editor of Journal of Moral Education, Monica Taylor. And she says, "I think authors need to think, what is it like to be an editor of a journal? How many papers is the editor receiving per day, per week? What is going to actually make the journal pay attention to my paper?" So essentially, you need to grab the editor's attention, because editors deal with many submissions to their journal year on year, and we are seeing submission trends rising as well. So some of our most popular journals receive more than 400 submissions per year. So you want to think about making sure your article stands out from the crowd and is polished as far as possible before submission. Here is a helpful to-do list to help yourself write your piece. So you can look at previously published papers in the journal to work out what sorts of content actually gets through to acceptance. Again, make sure you read the aims and scope and make sure your paper fits to that. So that will have all of the goals of the journal, what sort of content they do and do not publish, and will really help to make sure your article doesn't get rejected straight away. Make sure you format your article to the journal's requirements, and there are templates usually online for each journal. So eSurge has a specific template that's quite straightforward, but this is important to follow. Make sure you know how to submit it. So follow the instructions on the submission site as well. Check your spelling and grammar. Consider English polishing or someone that can help you edit along those lines. And there are many editing services available, including one affiliated with Taylor and Francis. A really good idea is also to ask a colleague to read it and to be what is termed a critical friend. So a lot of the review process for articles actually happens before initial submission. There is a lot of work in departments that goes on with helping each other to critique and to really polish articles before submitting. And here are some pitfalls to avoid. So overlooking the title, meaning that it's too long or too short or doesn't describe the article properly. And I'll come on to that in a bit more detail soon. Rushing the abstract so that it's not clear, it's jumbled, or is just, not representative of the piece. And again, more details on that to follow. Ignoring the instructions for authors. And this is something that Chris has just posted about in the chat, and it's really important to follow for journals. It feels like an onerous thing to do, but it will save time down the line because it will make sure that your article isn't turned around again immediately after submission. Ignoring the bibliography or the references list. So an example would be that this is jumbled, it's not consistent with how references are listed, or references from in the text of the manuscript are actually not included at the reference list at the end. Leaving your acronyms unexplained, self-explanatory. Forgetting to clear any copyright. So this applies to reuse of images or other figures that have already been published elsewhere. So the copyright will be owned by someone else in those cases, and you need to get permission to reuse that if you want to republish. And that's something that should be done before initial submission to the journal. Missing out attachments of figures, tables, and images. These usually need to be uploaded as separate files when you submit your manuscript to a system. Finally, don't send the incorrect version of your paper. And it seems obvious, but you'd be surprised how often this actually happens. Make sure you send the final version. So a little bit about structure and formatting here. In terms of structure, this can differ by journal and article type, but a very basic structure for an original research article would essentially follow title, abstract, and keywords, introduction, methods, results, discussion, and then references. In terms of formatting, you can find templates online for a specific journal. As referenced previously, there is a template for eSurge online. It's quite straightforward, but it will just help the editor and reviewers to easily locate each section when looking through many submissions, because things will be sort of in the same place and formatted in the same way when you're comparing and looking through various manuscripts. There are a lot of requirements on instructions for authors' pages. Some key points for the eSurge style specifically include a word limit of 5,000 words, making sure you follow the Chicago author date reference style. And there is a guide on how to do that available online as well. No footnotes included in these manuscripts, and ensuring the abstract is 100 to 150 words. Again, all these points do seem time-consuming, but they will save time down the line if they are done correctly from the start. So thinking a little bit about the title and abstract and keywords now. So the title and abstract are your article's shop window, so make them attractive and attention-grabbing. Put the so what factor at the start. Definitely include it in your abstract and possibly in your title. The so what factor refers to what makes your research important and novel, and what makes it an original and new contribution to your field, which means it absolutely has to be published. So we recommend really including that as high up as possible. Try to use clear, concise language that can be understood by someone outside your field. This will help have wider reach beyond academia and possibly for policymakers, for example, and practitioners. Make sure you draw out the main issues you're looking to address in both the title and abstract, whilst being succinct and brief. The abstract and title are sent to reviewers when they're invited to review, which gives an additional reason to get them right from the start. So having an engaging and clear abstract could lead to a quicker peer review process. So keywords and titles and abstracts in general are also helpful for discoverability. Most people find research now through Google, so it's helpful to think about what readers most commonly would search for if they want to find out about your article, and to use these in your title and abstract. The title should be accurate whilst also drawing readers in. So it's important that this is accurate and try to avoid sensationalized language. So readers can be frustrated if they click through to a title and the piece doesn't match the actual title. Some people would even say that's a form of clickbait. So search engines as well, they list results in a different priority order, and that changes over time based on user behavior. So if your article is coming up, and if readers click on the article and they don't stay on the piece and they click away very quickly, this will in time lead to your article appearing lower down in Google search and being less discoverable. In terms of keywords, these are essentially short phrases or individual words to just summarize your article and the topic discussed there. It might be tempting to go quite broad with this in terms of showing up in more search results, but we recommend being more specific, as it means your article will appear on searches that are relevant to the topic. So if you choose something too broad, such as early childhood education, there'll be much more competition in the search engines for this phrase. So your work is actually less likely to appear in the first few pages of the results. Here's some words of advice from one of our other editors about titles. We would typically expect a strong title, a good title that really expressed what the article was about and made it clear to the reader exactly what the topic was. And it's amazing how often writers neglect to do that. So that's from Professor Mark Brunjet, who is the editor of Education 3 to 13. So moving on to a little bit about ethics for authors. So this covers publication ethics. Research ethics is a separate topic here. Publication ethics has many elements to it, so this isn't an exhaustive list, but here are some common pitfalls to avoid. Be wary of self-plagiarism. So don't reuse chunks of text from work that you've previously published without citing it. Of course, don't plagiarize others either, but authors tend to be caught out more with self-plagiarism. Don't submit a paper to more than one journal at a time. So this is duplicate submission, and it is a breach of publishing ethics that's quite serious. Only submit to one journal and only submit to a new journal if you've received a reject decision from the first place. If you submit to two at once, it's a serious waste of time for editors and reviewers in the community, as collectively the community is needing to assess the same article twice. Relatedly, don't send an incomplete paper just to get feedback on it. Again, it's not the best use of the precious time of editors and reviewers. Make sure you always include or acknowledge all co-authors and let them know when you've submitted the paper to the journal. A lot of ethics cases in publishing relate to authorship disputes now, so make sure that everyone who authored the paper knows what is going on and where they will be listed in the order of authors as well. Do make sure that you mention any source of funding for your paper. This will usually be mandated by the funder, but it's important to declare for any conflict of interest that might become apparent. If you are using images or data sets produced by someone else, check that you've got permission to use them in your article. So that relates to the earlier point about copyright for reusing images or other people's work. You can get more information on ethics for authors in journal publishing by clicking the link shown on this page. And there's a lot of information on that site, which is run by Taylor and Francis. After you've submitted your article, it will go through to peer review. So just to quickly recap on what peer review is, It allows an author's research to be evaluated and commented upon by independent experts. So it will be submitted to the journal editor, and typically they will send it out for peer review. I'll go on to the workflow on the following slides. The goals of peer review are to check for many features of quality ahead of publication, but mostly for the robustness of the analysis and the methodology and the conclusions, and also for the quality of the writing and the expression. So it verifies that the article is suitable for publication in an academic journal. The anonymization varies between journals. So double-blind peer review or double anonymous peer review is most common in the humanities and social sciences. This means that peer reviewers never find out the name or identity of the author during peer review. Of course, they'll find out if it's eventually published, but during the peer review process, they are completely blind to that information. Additionally, the author doesn't know the identity of the reviewer, so that's why it's called double blind in this case. There are other anonymization options, such as single blind peer review, which is when the reviewers do know the author's identity, but authors never know the reviewer. However, double blind, where everyone is anonymous from each other, is the standard in humanities and social sciences journals, such as eSurge. And every article published in a Taylor and Francis journal has gone through peer review. This diagram shows a simplified version of the peer review process. So the first point after submission, after the administrative checking has been completed, is the editor assessing the manuscript to check that the basics are there. On eSurge, this involves the assessment of an editorial panel to see if it's suitable for review. The aim of this stage is to reduce the workload for full peer reviewers by filtering out and triaging papers that are not suitable for full peer review. And this helps reduce their workload and reduce the ask on peer reviewers. If the manuscript is judged not to be suitable for review for any reason, a desk reject decision can happen at this stage by the editor, but it will always come with editor comments. So if it's sent out to reviewers, they will then submit their reviews and the editor will assess those. Apologies. The editor will then submit a decision. This can vary by journal, but essentially it can be an accept, it can be minor amendments or minor revisions, it can be major amendments or major revisions, or it can be reject. It's very likely that you'll be asked for changes and revisions before final acceptance. Only a tiny proportion of articles are accepted with no revisions. Once you amend your paper and resubmit it, it will be classed as a revised manuscript and we'll go back through the process again. But for revised manuscripts, the process is usually a lot shorter. And sometimes the editor will read the revised manuscript themselves without sending to the external reviewers. If the article is accepted, it will go through to the production stage, and I'll talk a little bit about what happens there in a few slides' time, and then it will be published online. And usually this whole process happens through an online submission system, such as Scholar One, which is the system that eSurge uses. But again, different journals will use different sites. So here's some guidance on handling reviewers' comments if you receive a revised decision. Try to accept the feedback and revise as requested if you can. If you can't complete the revisions, explain why. And if it's a reasonable explanation, the editor should take that into account. Turn the revision round on time to meet the deadline if you possibly can. Thank the reviewers for their time as well, just as a courtesy. If you're responding to reviewers, try to be specific in which comments you're replying to. So try to avoid replying to all reviewer comments in general when submitting a revision. If you're defending your position, be assertive but not aggressive. And you can always turn to the editor for guidance, as a good editor will want to help. And I know that Tony, as editor of the journal, and Chris as well, are very willing to provide help and guidance on this. Here are the top 10 reasons for rejection from journals. So again, a list of what to avoid. Number 1, sent to the wrong journal or doesn't fit the aims and scope, or fails to engage with issues addressed by the journal. Possibly not a true journal article. It could be a thesis or a journalistic article, or just an opinion piece really that doesn't have academic merit. Too long or too short compared to the journal's word limits. Poor regard of the journal's conventions or for academic writing generally. Again, this relates to those that are more opinion pieces. Poor style, grammar, punctuation, or English. Has no contribution to the subject, so it has no novelty. It's not bringing anything new to the field. Not properly contextualized and poor theoretical framework. So both of these relate to making sure you're building on the literature that's come before you and really taking that into account in your work. Scrappily presented and sloppily proofread, links to number 5. And then finally, some pieces are just libelous, unethical, or lacking in objectivity, and really shouldn't be published for those reasons. If your article is rejected, we advise that you do nothing for a few days. Try to not take it personally, especially as most journals are working toward a specific page limit for the year, and therefore many more articles are rejected than are accepted. Additionally, a lot of pieces that are eventually published have been rejected several times by other journals before eventual publication. You could choose to use the reviewer's comments, alter the paper, and submit to another journal. But if you do this, make sure you alter your paper to the new style of that journal, as the editor can easily detect a paper that was submitted originally to a different journal. If you're asked to resubmit to the original journal, you have to decide if it's worthwhile based on your experience already. So let's assume that you've been accepted. What comes next? The production processes are the final inputs before publication. So you will receive your proofs of your manuscript at this point. And these are the version of your manuscript that's formatted into the style of the journal. So this is how it will appear in print before it goes online as well, and it's how it will appear online as well. This is called the proof, and you'll always get a chance to check this and submit corrections to this before publication. You will also have the publishing agreement sent through to you, and this is essentially the legal part where you transfer copyright and exclusive right to publish that article to the publisher or the copyright owner of the journal. So the copyright owner needs this to be signed before your work can be published, as it covers the copyright essentially. And you should check through this carefully, as it will outline what your obligations are as an author, especially what you can and cannot do in terms of sharing your article after publication. So you've been published now. What's next? We advise that the journey doesn't stop here. And to find Find out more about how to promote your work post-publication, please try and attend the session tomorrow. This should be Wednesday, not Tuesday, apologies, from 11 to 12 p.m. with Ben Hudson, Marketing Manager at Taylor & Francis. And that brings me to the end of my slides. So thank you very much for listening. I will turn to questions at the end, but for now, I will hand over to Chris and Tony. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thanks, Abby, for that really detailed and practical and helpful presentation on writing and submitting for publication. As Abby said, Tony and I established the journal, I think it's virtually 30 years ago now, and part of our motivation was to provide a forum with a European perspective. There was an absence, we felt, of platforms where our strong European tradition could be fully explored and represented. But of course, the journal is open to international and global contributions, because we think we should be looking out as well as having people look in, and that dynamic is essential. But it very much is located in a European tradition. And the other thing we were trying to do when establishing the journal was to really provide an academic and scholarly forum that met the best and highest international standards of science and production, but applied to the early childhood sector, which is a complex sector. It's multidisciplinary, it's multi-sector, and we were trying to encourage a multi-paradigmic approach. So going across the qual and quant debate, and we publish papers from both ends of that spectrum, and for those that like to blend the two things. And we were also aware that many in our sector were engaged in practice-based, and often that was qualitative, and we wanted to raise the rigor of the research in that field. So it had lots and lots of layers to it. Back then, we also felt our sector, in terms of research and paradigm, was quite undeveloped. So the journal was always a developmental process, as is our annual conference. And we wanted to work with new authors and developing authors to help them and support them in that process of writing and preparing their work for publication and then getting it published. So there was the feedback, the review process, we always took a lot of time and attention to. We were also really aware in our field and in our organisation, the majority of people were not native English speakers, and yet the language of the journal was English. So we particularly wanted to help authors with the fluency, and originally we did publish abstracts in 4 or 5 languages. We stopped doing that some while back, but we try and give authors support with the language, or encourage them to get support if English isn't their first language. So being aware of that, the journal is very inclusive in terms of paradigm, methodology, sector and perspective on that, but it does have this core aim. And thinking of part of our editorial policy is we have a prime concern with research that has utility and aids social action and supports social justice. So that bit of the research of your research, your paper, which is the so whatness that Abby talked about, how does that bit of knowledge that you've generated, what use is it? How does it help us? Is it geared to shift policy? Is it geared to shift an aspect of practice? Making that application or that utility really visible in your abstract and your title, hopefully, will catch the editorial team's eye. And the one thing, we do get hundreds of papers. So part of you is your task is to make your paper lift it out of the pile. And so we're looking for innovation. We're looking at some groundbreaking new stuff, topical stuff that builds on and extends what we already know and can communicate that in a very clear way. And as I say, title and abstract and keywords, as Abby said, are really key to that. Just in terms of the many papers that I've reviewed and authors I've helped with, just to pick up on a couple of areas where you're going to be sent for rejection or major submission if these things aren't addressed. And the bottom line is, if the language and the scientific conventions, these basic conventions that are in the notes for authors, in terms of formatting, checking how things are cited, the length of the article, that it's meeting the brief of the journal. You know, a lot of articles get straight to rejection because those basic things haven't been met. And we depend so much on our team of reviewers that we can't really, you know, send them manuscript where they've got to be picking up grammar and punctuation or saying the age range isn't appropriate. So really make sure that it sits with our journal, and we're going to get excited by you inviting us to read your article in depth. Where things, for me, some of the ouch points or ouch points, things that I find quite difficult is, and we posted it and make quite a lot of it now. EC-ERA is very value-based and we try to promote a very strong code of ethics in our community, in the way we operate, and it's very rights-based, and we're really very proud of our promotion of children's rights and young children's rights. So I'm going to come to the big area where there remains a lot of absence of really good, rigorous reflection and discussion and articulation, is the section where you lay out your methodology and then you talk about the ethics that are involved in your paper. And whether we do accept review papers and we do accept theoretical papers as long as they've got applications. But there is no paper that doesn't have ethics in it. Quite often they'll say it's a desk-based piece of research which has no ethical issues. But actually, the way you've identified your material, the literature, are ethical choices. And we developed quite a full set of ethical guidelines, which we're in the process of reviewing, by the way. But being clear that we would expect all articles to have a section in it where they address the ethical issues. And it's not enough just to say that your piece of research was approved by the university or some other ethical body. That paper and the particular focus brings particular issues depending on who you've worked with and how you've worked. And so we would really expect and encourage you to really make sure that those ethical issues and how you navigated them are quite clear, because people are learning from you. And it's quite amazing how many published papers have no reference at all to ethics, not in our journal, but in many other journals. And in our journal, we've become more and more concerned to check. One of our first checks is how do they deal with the ethics involved in this piece of work? And of course, part of that is, are they really seeing young children as competent, articulate, rights-based people who have the right to participate, and non-participation, and all those things we'd apply to adults need to be applied to very young children. So that's one area where I'd encourage you to pay particular attention, and we'd be attracted by papers that were very clear with those issues, and it was very clear that the ethics were met. Another area where often papers are weaker is in the applications. I said earlier, we really want action to follow, the so whatness. So there should be a really thoughtful reflection at the back end, at least, about how this piece of knowledge might be useful to the sector. You know, is it aimed at policymakers, decision makers? Is it at system level, or is it at practice level? You know, is it aimed at those who work with families? Is it aimed at those who work with young children? Is it aimed with those who develop services? So being very clear about who this knowledge might be helpful for and how it might be helpful. Again, that's something we find often poorly done, because authors think, well, I've done the research, then the field can decide whether it's helpful or not. But we want you to make some suggestions, make that link quite explicit in at the front and the back end, at least, of your proposal. And then the final bit, and then I'm going to hand over to Tony, that I think is often poorly done, is the theoretical basis and the conceptual basis. Where does this piece of work sit theoretically and conceptually? What are the key concepts, and are you explaining those key concepts that you're exploring in your investigation? How do you define those things in relation to the way you've investigated? What concepts are you using, and what theories underpin the way you've explored it and the way you're looking at your data? So that section on theoretical and conceptual underpinnings and clarification of terms and terminology is really important, particularly for an international audience, because people have different perspectives on that. So keep the articles coming, keep writing, guys, keep researching. We really are encouraging practice-based research, so that's from practitioners or others that work with that practical and policy orientation. But we are interested in papers that do reviews of the sector or the field. Those are really useful articles that get a lot of interest, because in a way that article's done a lot of legwork for others in the community. So if you're good at those kind of review perspectives and can look across and do a rigorous review article, we really like those too. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Tony now, and I'm sure he's got some perspectives, being the coordinating editor of the journal, on some other aspects of the authoring process. Tony, are you there? Hi. Over to you.
I am here. I arrived a little late because I had difficulties with communication. I'm conscious that we're running out of time, and I'd rather I'd rather deal with some of the questions that may have been put in the chat. Let's see if there aren't any. But let me just go over. I mean, thanks very much, Abby, for your input, and yours, Chris. I'd really like to just go back to the very the way we started, and we were talking about Froebel and Montessori and Freinet and all those giants of early childhood studies historically, and we wanted to keep that tradition alive. And in those early days, the field that we're talking about, this discipline, was dominated, I think, by developmental psychology, and in particular by two journals. And at one time, those two journal editors were in the same university, in the same corridor. And when we're talking about, oh, this journal is citing that journal, it becomes hermetically sealed if we're not careful. So one of our intentions was to actually was to spread that vision and talk about early childhood studies as a discipline in itself. Of course, we could have sociology in that, we could have health studies, we could have family and so on studies, and we could have developmental psychology, but we wanted to have a journal that had applications for policy and practice. And we also wanted to look for new methodologies around that, and particularly, as I said in the chat, trying to capture children's voice. So if I said, what is it that's unique about our journal, I'd say it's internationalism, although it has a European focus. And I think Europe has a different view because it's often more interested in social welfare and support for children and families than some of those countries that tend towards more neoliberalism. So I think it's international in its acceptance of papers, and in its reach and in its distribution, as Abby said before. Although we print in English, it's not specifically Anglophone. And in fact, most papers that we've received this year have been from Turkey and from Norway, neither of which is native English speakers. we're interested in applications and implications of the research, not just the research itself. As Chris said, we're open to different paradigms, different methodologies and different methods, and especially those that seek to include the voices of the children that we're actually looking at. And we are big in ethics, and in the chat I've given you a link to the ethical code that we designed. So I think that's probably enough from me, and I'm happy to, if you want to have a debate or if we want to pick up any of the Q&As. Sean, have we got
great.
something?
Thanks.
Yeah.
There is one question. So, any advice for first-time authors anxious about the peer review element? I'm assuming the feedback is developmental. So, Tony, would you be able to take that one?
Yeah, well, as you explained in the process, it's a double-blind review, and the way that we use our reviewers is that that all our reviewers have published, and that they all have a doctorate, of course, and they have been through a process of career review and development. In fact, we've got something within this conference for the development of the reviewers. And the reviewers will give us keywords. The keywords that you put into your article are used to select the kind of reviewers we want. So the reviewer is not only linked into early childhood, but linked specifically to the area of research that you've done. And we tend to use at least the reviewers in different countries. So we always have that international perspective. We try and have more. Of course, we have 2 reviewers, and we tend to place those in different countries. Depending on the volume that we get, and this is a big issue. I mean, obviously, we have nearly 200 submissions, and submissions tend to be seasonal. So sometimes we have more sort of towards the end of the summer holidays, when people have had more time for reflection and so on. We will introduce a system where we have a quick review, a primary review, where we give them a sort of immediate feedback. And then you go through that process. If you get through that process, you go into full review and you get the full papers. You get a double review of the full papers. If your review isn't accepting and it's asking for revisions, and I have to say I think it's something like only 3% of the submissions go through immediately without any revisions. So expect that you're going to get revisions. And hopefully that will allow you then to resubmit, take on board the submissions. And that is the more common process by which people are accepted for publication.
Thank you, Tony. There is one more question in the chat that I'm going to put to you, and then we'll wrap it up as we're at the hour. So the question is, could you please give some examples of your vision about research and practice-based articles? For example, could it be about new theorization of pedagogical approaches? Well,
Chris, I don't know if you want to come in here, because it's really about what does eSERA stand for.
Yeah. I mean, the one thing just also to say is absolutely we're living and developing. eSERA is a developmental community, and it's very open, and we really do want to support the sector. So the review process and the authoring process, there's a lot of work to do before you submit with your colleagues. But we as an editorial team will also work with you too. And comments are very practical and pragmatic and very clear about guidance that you're given. So I'm hoping that you'd see it in the spirit of constructive feedback. And in that sense, it's developmental. In terms of the research and practice and policy, and always bring practice and policy into, our organisation is about generating knowledge to help us move our sector forward, which is why the applications need to be there. So if it is a theoretical, we love theory and we're interested in different theoretical perspectives and developments, but we want theories that, Lewin, who talks about there's nothing so practical as a good theory. Theories are there to help us think about policy and practice, help us inform our actions. So even a theoretical paper should have some reflection on practice. And in that sense, it's a fusion of the research and the practice and the policy. So the practice and the policy should help us focus our research, because they bring dilemmas and questions and issues. And then the research should investigate and explore that and then feed that back in. But all the time in the papers, there's that dynamic of praxis, reflection and action going on in relation to the research that you've done and the knowledge that you've generated. And within that framework, anything goes. The journal's interested in everything to do with practice and policy related to young children. And it might be a more health-based issue. It might be a more social care-based issue. It might be a more pedagogical. But remember, the journal's called the Early Childhood Education Journal, because we have that broad view of education that children are learning and developing from birth through. So it's how we support the development of that young child's potential. So keep that frame in mind as well, that it is about how we support children either in the home or in their communities to thrive, really, in the broadest sense of that work. We have a very broad view of what education means in relation to young children's development. So yeah, it's a fusion, and but we should be able to trace in an article how the research is going to be helpful to policy or practice, or a blend of that, and how policy and practice, the context, has fed that research. Why is it important in that wider context? Why does that piece of research matter? Why is it important to get that knowledge out there? Is it because there's a gap, or there's something new happening in the field that hasn't happened before, that needs exploring? So that rationale of how it fits and how it sits with what's going on in that wider context is really important too. But
a number of articles come in, especially from after as post-conference, where people have met, and what you have is not a single author but co-authors, often in different countries, who have come together at the conference and decide they want to collaborate on undertaking some research, which they then publish. I would say quite a few of our articles have that kind of source. Another source would be that we will have early career researchers who've just done their PhDs. And I would have to warn people, don't think you can just cram your PhD into, of course, it can be the basis of what you do, but sometimes it's quite obvious that that's what's happening. But instead of writing an article for a journal, people are just trying to republish some element of their doctorate.
Thank you, Chris and Tony. That's so interesting, and yeah, really illuminating there. And yeah, I hope that's helpful to the question asker. She says, thank you for explaining so clearly. So
yeah, Sarika is actually at the moment, I hope she doesn't mind me sharing this, at the moment in publishing in one of our book series. And it's not just the journal, and we're going to have another session, I know, on the book series. So when you are thinking about publication, there are lots of different platforms and you can use them, blog sites and so on, all relevant to ECERA.
Yeah, so exactly. Thanks so much, Tony. So we're 5 minutes past the hour, and I think I will wrap it up here. Thanks everyone for attending. I hope you found this helpful. Thank you so much to Chris and Tony for sharing your thoughts as well. And remember that you can watch this back for 60 days after today. So for anyone, I guess they won't be here, but anyone that had to leave early, you can pass on to them that they can catch up later on. And yeah, have a great afternoon, everybody. Thanks for attending and for listening.
Thanks everyone.